So what is he saying? He's saying, you guys, you got it clear. You got so many things going right in your life, but there's a problem. It's a problem of first love. That there was a day, maybe 60, 40, 30 years ago, when you used to have first passion for God, that you loved Him more than anything and anyone. He's saying, but you're this little lighthouse in a corner. You're sitting on this port city of Ephesus. They're off of the Aegean. And you have so much knowledge, but it's knowledge beyond your level of obedience. You stockpile this information in your mind, and you're about philosophies, and you can answer things theologically, but in the end, there's a huge problem. The ESV says that you have abandoned your first love. So, he's saying there's something wrong. There's a love deficit. As I look into the heart core, the one who walks amongst the candlesticks, the one who holds the seven messengers, the angels in his hand, he says there's something wrong, that there's a vacuous place, that when you come in, you just don't have that first hunger, love for God anymore, and that's not cool. Sad. How did Jesus summarize the whole Old Testament? Remember the lawyer came one day and said, hey, summarize the whole thing. He said this, you should love the Lord your God, what? With all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He says that love for me, that first priority vertical love, it's become less visible. And how is that love for God visible? It's through our love for each other. So when my vertical love for God is passionate, when it's in place, my love for His church and His brothers and sisters will be in check as well. If my love for the brothers is not visible, we work it backwards and say, okay, maybe the solution is my first love for God is not in place like it should be. And so he's saying there is a real problem. There's a problem. That my love for God should be greater than my love for my neighbors, than my relatives, than my church. It should be the premier love. But you can't avoid that. You can't divorce it from my love for His people. It's got to be connected. You see the connection there? You have lost your first love, he says. You don't love me or each other as you did at first. So, with that clarity, think back to a relationship. When I do marriage counseling, it's always interesting that when I look at couples, sometimes they just start to drift. Such is the natural inertia of relationships. When we are not working intentionally on keeping the relationship alive, we start to drift apart. When we don't keep this relationship with God alive, what happens? We get this God drift in our life. And it starts to show up in how we behave or don't behave around God's people. So wedding day, it's that loving feeling day. It's that day when everything is just beautiful and the honeymoon is before you, and you love those moments because your feelings are just doing everything for you, and it's easy to follow your heart when your feelings are leading one way. But when we have the feelings stop, what is a Christian to do when there's a cooling, when there's a fading love that goes on in our DNA? Well, here's the principle. I want us to get this, to revitalize, to re-energize. To get this love going back again in my life, we need to return to our first love. So the back part of our sermon now, let's just talk very practically. What's the antidote then? What is the antidote? What can we do in these moments? Are we just left to our own devices? Is there anything that we can do, should do? Is there any real clarity? And that's what I love about this simple formula. Look at verse 5, Rev 2. He says, number 1, look how far you have fallen. Remember, look how far you've fallen. In other words, he's saying, people, get back to that day. Get back to the day when you remember your first love for God was so alive and it consumed you, it gripped you, and it was so exciting. Get back to that moment. Do you remember the day you crossed the line and said yes to Jesus? Do you have that moment, that line, that story? Do you remember how everything looked a little different? Do you remember when you used to walk around, you just practiced His presence so naturally? I used to think God stuff, and it was not hard to think God talk. It was so a part of your everyday nature of how you lived your life. He says, get back to those moments when you were so overwhelmed by your sense of indebtedness that there was nothing you could do to satisfy God's anger against your sin. Get back to the day when you had this epiphany where God opened your eyes and He said, you know what? You desperately need the righteousness of somebody else, to put that into your account and to completely credit you before God so that you become, through an act of faith, as good as God. Get back to that day. Remember. Remember when you used to love to look in this book. Call it devotions, call it QT, call it whatever you want. Remember that day. Remember how it was so natural to think, well, what would Jesus do? WWJD. And you'd look into the book, and God would speak to you through His Word. And then remember how you'd talk back to God in such a natural sense. That was prayer, and the prayers happened throughout the day. Get back to that moment. Remember how it used to be. Do you remember that? If you're in a marital moment where you've drifted, remember how you used to touch each other. Remember how you used to bring flowers, and if you're not bringing flowers anymore, maybe that's part of the problem. The intentional effort that you've used to put into those relationships. He says, make sure that you are remembering how it used to be. I love to hike in the backcountry. I love just getting away. Jesus was into that. He loved to get away by himself to pray often in the wilderness, just to get away, to keep his sense of sanity and keep his clarity in his mind. And in those moments, there are times when we've been hiking as a backpacking club, we've been so far off course. How do you find your way back? Well, there's times where the only way to find your way back is to backtrack, to get back to the place where you veered off and find that place. When you get to that place, you start back on track again. So could it be that God is speaking? Is He helping us here? A couple that has Arctic winds that blow and there's iciness in the relationship, you got to get back to the place where you start to demarcate and you start to veer away from each other and say, okay, I remember that moment. I remember how it used to be. Can I just dream out loud for a few minutes? We still got some time. Can I tell you some good days? Because I know right now this 800, 1,600 pound gorilla gets our attention. Can we remember some good things for a few minutes? I think it's important. I want us to remember backwards. There were days in this place where God just showed up and rocked this flock in such an incredible way, where it was addictive. To sit here on the sidelines and to watch what God had done. I'm talking about the former church, the York Gospel Center. There were days when this church gave 56% of our budget, at that time over $300,000, to missions, to people eternity, to give people a chance. People gave heroically to give to the cause of getting the gospel. We were driven by thoughts like by Oswald Smith that people don't deserve to hear the gospel twice until everybody hears it once. In those moments where we got it, we are God's liberation commandos. We're a part of God's second incarnation, as it were. We're supposed to take the gospel wherever we find ourselves. We're supposed to spread it into our neighborhoods. I remember the days when this church found itself in desperate moments, but they were good moments. There was a former pastor that once said that nothing good here will happen at the Gospel Center, now Bridgeway, until they run out of money. There was a day when churches like this church measured itself by the 3 B's. You know the 3 B's, right? Buildings and bodies and bucks. And we had it all. We had about $800,000 in the bank. We had about 650 body count that was in this room. And we have the enviable campus, 10 acres. It's a beautiful spot on this planet.